This podcast is part of the Spoon Podcast Network, home of smart conversations that feed your mind.
So, what if the way we cultivate and fund our global food system could save us all? I'm Eva Goldborn, and welcome to Everything But the Carbon Sink, a podcast that delves into the exciting and sometimes messy intersection of food, climate, and the money that could change everything. Here with me today is a dear and wonderful, somewhat new friend, Sara Farley, Vice President of the Food Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation. Sara is also a fellow traveler of mine with our Imagine community, and Imagine is a global leadership community for impact. So Sara and I have been able to connect on that front, and there's been wonderful overlap in our work. Sara's going to be talking to us today about the Rockefeller Foundation's Food Initiative. You may be familiar with the Rockefeller Foundation, just a small foundation, just doing a little bit of work in this space. No, I kid. There, of course, tsunamis of impact in this world. But the Food Initiative aims to build a resilient, equitable, and sustainable food system to combat global challenges like hunger, malnutrition, and climate change. And through this work, Sara has the aim of shifting the diet quality of 500 million underserved people by 2030. So no small task. We'll dive into the role of philanthropy in particular in driving food system transformation, food systems as a climate solution, which is certainly relevant in my world of my work with Littlefoot, and what it really takes to scale these initiatives like Regen and tackling food waste to advance nutritional equity around the world. So welcome, Sara. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Eva, for having me. It's such a privilege. You're such a rock star, and I love all the topics that you're elevating in this work. So excited to have the conversation.
Thank you. And as I almost like, you know, there's no way to roll out the red carpet for you without this extensive intro that I just shared. You have a lot on your plate with this food initiative. And so I want to be able to sort of go through both the origin story of that work and sort of practically what that means. But even before we get there, you have had a storied career in food systems transformation for a long time. So I'd love to even start with your hero origin story of you've worked at the UN, you've worked at the World Bank, you've done a thing or two in this space before landing at this incredibly influential philanthropic institution. How have you interfaced with this work, and how's your career evolved through the years?
Well, I think like you, we both have a lot of tentacles. We're both interested in how things connect. And if I kind of go back to how I got into development, which is sort of the broader sector that I placed myself, you know, I came through this academic area of science, technology, and society because I always thought change happens at the intersections, like the intersections between sectors, between disciplines, between cultures. It's the tectonic plates rubbing up against each other that produces the most epic mountains and the greatest innovative breakthroughs. And so I came into development first at the World Bank, actually in a science, technology, innovation strategist role. And if you're interested in global development and poverty, which is really where I wanted to put my heart and my time and my passion, very quickly you land in agriculture because it is the big employer, right? So many countries, low and middle income countries, it's like 60% plus of the population, but it's also a third today of the greenhouse gas emissions. It's 86% of biodiversity loss, 75% of fresh water use. It's like, if you can solve the food puzzle, you have a blueprint and you have hope to solve just about any other challenge facing humanity. So it feels like the big challenging deep end. I've never been afraid of complexity, and yet at the same time, it's like this balance between complexity and total relatability because we all eat. We all have memories of food, foods that we love, foods that remind us of maybe our mothers or our grandmothers, our fathers, our siblings. Food is love. So I love this work.
I love that. And that theme, thankfully, comes up a lot in the conversations that we've been having on the podcast, too. And to your point, you know, those of us who find ourselves in food and ag work. It almost feels quite obvious because you're right, everybody eats and we all have this like deeply personal connection to this work. So I appreciate that sort of entry point. You again, sort of the mandate that you have at this point going into 2030. Okay, so we've got 5 more years. It was 500 million individuals impacted by your work. Share with us a little bit about the mandate that you have around what it sounds like both very much food security, but also nutritional quality as well.
Right. Well, actually, we just went to the board and just got approval for an even sharper focus on what had been an even broader mandate on food systems to bring two crucial areas of focus together. On the one hand, we had work and we want to continue to accelerate our work on the production side, which is really squarely asking, how do you meet producers, whether they are farmers, ranchers, fishers, how do you meet producers who are facing even more uncertainty when it comes to whether the rain will come, when it does, will it be a deluge or a sprinkle, actual weather events, soil fertility, crop loss. It's become already what was a challenging career has become horrifically unpredictable. And that's incredibly challenging when the ultimate aggregate role of farmers is to feed a planet that will have 10 million people by the year 2050. So how do we support farmers on a transition toward agroecological, climate resilient, call it regenerative food production, which requires a lot of innovation around financing, not to mention technical assistance, et cetera. But how do we do so with an eye toward the most vulnerable consumer? And there, the foundation has really taken a laser focus on school children because we see that disproportionately hunger and nutrition insecurity affect children, whether that's in rates of stunting or limiting their human development potential. And so our what if was like, what if you held those two objectives in one frame and pursued filling the void, which is a void, we're at a deficit right now of 300 million children today not getting a school meal, not getting any food at school. What if you filled that gap with not just business as usual food, which is perpetuating our greenhouse gas emissions, our soil infertility, our biodiversity loss, but what if you did it with regenerative food that supported farmer well-being, that built back soil quality, that sequestered carbon, that built back biodiversity? So we're calling this a regenerative school meals big bet. As Rockefeller, we will measure our success on getting 100 million children a school meal, increasingly through a regenerative production system. So a couple major innovations are going to be required to swing the bat at that ball, but that's what we're committed to with a whole host of really exciting philanthropic, farmer-based, and financial partners.
Incredible. And that means we've got like a million different directions to now go in on this because and thank you too in terms of sort of doing that double click on the regenerative ag system and what you're sharing as, you know, a typical focus for Rockefeller on producers, but then adding in this lens of nutrition access for children in deeply understanding not just those immediate short-term nutritional needs that children have that you described, but ultimately economic ability and economic mobility when children can focus on learning and focus on being kids and to be able to not be nutritionally deficient. What a world. And to the question that you asked, you know, what if? So I think that's really, really exciting. What does that actually mean? Because we've got the school food component, as you're saying, and that's like food service and also, you know, federal guidelines and regulations, US or other, you know, in other countries. And then on the farmer side on, you know, regenerative production. Let's break that down. There's a lot.
Exactly. So there's a lot of pieces, but we've kind of narrowed the focus to two major innovations. So, and I'll say these innovations really came to us because of the mountain of partners that are doing such extraordinary work who've inspired us and really grounded this work. So on the school meal side, there was 4 years ago now, the first ever United Nations Food Systems Summit. And one of its great legacies was the formation of various coalitions that sort of picked a piece of the big food systems puzzle to build constituency and mobilize action and kind of create a movement around. One of those, arguably, you could suggest the most successful of those in terms of size, has been the School Meals Coalition. So 109 member states have said, I promise to get to universal school feeding. And that's an extraordinary achievement. They have a research consortium. They have all these modalities to help support country leadership on that agenda. But they want to do more than get to universal coverage. They want to increase the quality of that meal. So one of the things that's needed to do that is technical expertise inside of countries' agencies that support school meals. So for example, in Kenya, that entity is called NACONEC. It is charged with feeding all children, of which there are 10 million in Kenya, a school lunch. Right now, Kenya is at about 2 million children. So the question is, how do you reach the additional 8 million? And how do you do so not with imported, polished white rice, but with foods grown by Kenyan farmers, who are a large percentage of the Kenyan population? And how do you bring the idea of growing food in a climate resilient way actually into the context, the educational context for Kenyan school children, so that if they go on to be farmers, they can be entrepreneurs of climate solutions for their community. So the innovation on the school meal side is this technical support and advisory support into the federal school meals entity to help with procurement specifications. So how do you write procurement specs so it's not just price first, but actually preferences local farmers? How do you do menu engineering at the level of the school so that the menus themselves start to balance out a little bit more protein, more whole grains? Those are the kinds of capacities that maybe need a little boost in some national school meals entities. On the production side, the main innovation is something we're calling lighthouses. So, for your listeners, who I know so many are part of the regenerative climate resilient movement, really doing incredible work on the financing and implementation side, there's a lot going on to get excited about. But still, it is in the shadow of a dominant conventional food system that is really still indexing on productivity over soil health, over worker safety, worker health, or profitability for farmers. And yet there are places where you're seeing not only this transition to climate resilient production, but you're simultaneously seeing farmers actually making it work, finance flowing, offtake happening. So we are identifying lighthouses where you have farmers on that transition, food system stakeholders, whether those are input providers, infrastructure folks present, where you have meaningful offtake, not just for export, but crucially for domestic markets, and you have some window into public procurement. Because ultimately we're talking about is using markets to enable this integration between supply and demand of regenerative production. It's about creating a catalyst that first and foremost serves children, but ultimately unlocks the full potential for the producers and for the investors that want to come in on this transition. So lighthouse selection and support on the producer side, and technical capacity and support on the consumer side. That's really the how of this big bet.
And thank you. And what a doozy, because when I'm hearing you say that, I'm like, yes. That like, this is a dream, concept. And to your point too, a lot of these activities are already in existence. This isn't, sort of a pipe dream. And at the same time, when I hear you describe this, I'm hearing a lot of different stakeholders are involved, which in all of our work in this space, that can sometimes take like 90% of the effort. So I I sort of want to understand from you, what are maybe the challenges or some of the wins that you have already started to see or you're anticipating with coordinating, because you're not only, to your point, coordinating across one part of the supply chain where it's, the consumer, the eater, in this case, the student, but it's all the way back to the farm. And in some cases, I'm hearing too, it's helping to transition farmers away from current practices into new ones. So how are you approaching the stakeholder management of all of that?
Yeah. There's really only one way to do it, which is a network of networks play. So, the role of philanthropy isn't to engineer systems change. It's to identify the enablers of systems change, find those acupuncture points, and put a little support right where it's needed. So we've been scouting and frankly learning deeply learning from a host of networks that already exist in the key geographies where we're doing this work, which include Kenya, Tanzania, Brazil, India, Midwest US, and we're exploring other places too, like Indonesia and the Philippines. What we're finding, and your question is such an important one, like how do you manage stakeholders? So if you take a network of networks approach, then the question becomes, what is the glue that is needed to support networks that really actually have quite a lot in common, who share some objectives that maybe aren't yet cohering those objectives in a meaningful way. So I'll give you two examples of what it can look like. One of those is something called Regen 10. So effectively, this is a network that's straddling big farmer groups. So that includes the World Farmers Organization, East Africa Farmers Federation. We're talking representation of tens of millions of farmers. It also includes the World Business Council of Sustainable Development, so some of the biggest corporates committed to a sustainability agenda. But it also includes FOLU and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which includes member states and bodies supporting both science and conservation and nature goals. So we've helped provide some funding and secretariat support to bring those networks together around the question, how do you even know if regeneration is happening? Like, what do you actually measure? Because it's not consistent in finance, it's not consistent in business, it's not consistent farmer to farmer. And if it's not really unlocking the tsunami, as you said, maybe something a little less destructive, it is not possible. So that's been one network that's really made some big strides. That's a hard table to hold. Those are very diverse stakeholders that all view the world quite differently, but they've gone through a process of really building an agenda and an outcomes framework together. Another example, and I'm actually just fresh out of an incredibly inspiring week with many of these stakeholders, is an effort called RAFT, which is basically a bunch of funders. We keep growing by the week. Funders like Rockefeller, who said, wow, this is so complicated. There are so many stakeholders. Even if you just do this in Kenya, you can barely get your arms around all the pieces of the puzzle. We have got to do this as a team sport, not a solo act. So what's happened now over the last 2 years, this group of funders, we're now 32, have first built a shared theory of change. Like, what are we looking to unlock? What are those acupuncture points that add up to a regenerative transition? So we got that out of the way, published it at COP28, got to some alignment. Now what we're doing,
philanthropic funders or
it started with philanthropic. Okay. Totally. But what's exciting is it's transforming, because we ultimately recognize the philanthropic funding, important, catalytic, way smaller than the private investment, let alone the public investment. So now we're working with a vast variety of farmer groups and government in Kenya and Tanzania, as well as in Brazil and India, but we're going to start with Kenya and Tanzania, to document and specify the actual costs of each layer of this regenerative transition. Think of that as a strategic investment framework, almost like a shopping list, but a really detailed, complicated, vetted one. And then what we just did a week ago is we brought multilateral investors, so African Development Bank, bilateral funders, the German government in this particular instance, but there are others involved, private investors, and then philanthropy to say, okay, now we have a full 360 view on what is needed at county level. So we're looking at Murang'a County in Kenya Then
Really
it's like,
detailed.
let's start calling balls. Like, what are you, okay, you're going to be on technical assistance. They need this. We'll be on market orchestration. They need that. So you're starting to actually construct matches between needs and, frankly, supply of capital to get to those needs in a way that's really joined up, really participatory, and, frankly, at a quantity of capital that is simply infeasible if we were to do this alone.
I think that's such an extraordinarily powerful example, and especially really putting the, like you're saying, shopping list. I think of it as putting the price tags on those solutions, because even in my first interactions and interface with Rockefeller Foundation, it was when I was with the Refed team, and you were, I think it was the YieldWise initiative, focused on on post-harvest losses. And as part of that, on our work with the grant from Rockefeller, the Refed roadmap was focused on doing exactly that, of the cost-effective, scalable solutions that were in existence today, or yesterday, since it was back in 2015. But that was really powerful for capital providers to then be able to just do exactly that, like put the numbers behind what these solutions look like, because it also, and tell me if you agree with this in your work now, it reveals which types of financial gaps are suited for which types of financial vehicles.
Exactly.
So not just the numbers, but the risk appetite involved, and then you can start putting the pieces together of different types of capital from there.
Exactly. That's exactly the game. And it's something that I think all financial providers, we're guilty of sort of understanding our own tribe, and then some of the other capital types a little harder to demystify. And it really does take deep collaboration, everyone getting around a table to figure out, how do we de-risk that 10x investment that we could see unlocked from private capital holders? What does it actually take from philanthropy? And then what is the case we have to make to repurpose subsidies, which are dwarfing private investors in philanthropy as well? I think that the real win we want to achieve is a table that is fueled by enough data, evidence, and commitment to collaboration that we can get all of those flows moving in parallel.
Along those same lines, too, I'm curious, how much interfacing do you do with those, the public funding sides, on the government side, and also with corporate investments? Because in a perfect world, everybody is in sync, and you've alluded to these challenges as well. As Rockefeller and as your team, how much effort or interface do you have to put in, even sort of convincing or helping these corporates understand the role that you can play as a catalytic funder, but then the sort of passing the ball off to the next stakeholder in the the financial value chain?
I mean, we're in a really, I think, enviable position in that a lot of private sector and networks like the World Business Council and Sustainable Development are coming to us and saying, this is where we want to go. We can take the action agenda on regenerative landscapes of the World Business Council and Sustainable Development. That was a marquee priority and sort of area of action for COP a year and a half ago. And that really is an example of corporates aligning in a pre-competitive space to get to specific landscapes like the Cerrado in Brazil, and basically do the same homework. Who is touching what piece of these value chains? How can we bring in more investment? What is the role for philanthropy? So we're taking those kinds of invitations really seriously. Also, recognizing that it's really crucial that we never forget that the center of this agenda is it's two individuals. It's the producer and it is the most vulnerable consumer. If we start to stray from that, we get really wobbly in terms of our North Star. I think there is a danger that a lot of these conversations happen without farmers in the room. And you need only look at the average age of farmers globally is hovering around 60. People don't want to do their job. They don't want to feed.
Not a popular field.
right? For so many valid reasons. So if we
Yeah.
don't do this in a way that gets them really excited to be a part of this transition, we're in a lot of trouble. And similarly, and I look at the organic movement, which has achieved so much, and yet still the 20 years on, the organic agriculture sector is at plus or minus 2, maybe 3% global market share.
Mm.
We don't have 20 years to make climate resilient
No,
agriculture
we don't have the
2%,
time.
right? So it's important that in our collaborations with private sector and with big finance, we're also indexing on who we're trying to feed and they are represented, and who is feeding us and they are represented.
That's just really helpful insight into another project, and I'm so glad that you mentioned the action agenda on regenerative landscapes by name as well, because I just happened to finish supporting a part of that project,
Oh, yeah.
including in particular on the Brazil side. So as I'm hearing you say all of this again, sort of this like beautiful orchestration of these different types of capital stacks in the Cerrado, in this very strategically relevant part of the world, 25% of, soy is produced, and the impact on cattle, and therefore, protein for the global supply chain, a huge degree of biodiversity in that area, not just in the Amazon, which is, what most of us think of Brazil and biodiversity being primarily in the Amazon. And I sort of want to have you untangle this and challenge you a little bit on this in terms of, yes, we have you in the room, the Rockefeller Foundations of the world. And again, maybe you're right. Tsunami was a poor choice of words. Maybe a beautiful, robust, strategic boulder of impact. Maybe is another way of putting it. But you do have all of the large CPGs in the room for that work. You do have all the agribusinesses, fertilizer, everybody, and also MAPA, the support of the Ministry of Agriculture, Environment. In theory, and it's true, we have everybody in the room that we should have. But one of the things that I have observed and sort of been able to uncover a little bit more in working on that project from a different angle is the philanthropic part is so unbelievably important, because it's signaling for these corporates, which is a little bit annoying thinking about, like, okay, they have the dollars to do this. Why don't they just do it? But we also know it has to be consistent with a business case for them. And like, it is what it is. So philanthropy plays that de-risking patient capital role. But Rockefeller and sort of these larger institutional foundations have huge impact and value. What is the interface and interplay for smaller foundations or different types of foundations to sort of fill in the gaps where in some ways you are so big, you are so catalytic, and then there may be some pockets of dollars or projects or research that needs to happen that might not be a fit for a Rockefeller? Where do those other foundations and that role of philanthropy play out?
Yeah, and this is actually one of the many rationales for this thing raft that I was talking about with 32 funders. So
I love that.
many of us were in Brazil. Many food funders, philanthropies, were in Brazil, actually on the Amazon a year ago, January, and we had many local philanthropies, Brazilian philanthropies, and regranters join us. And I was stunned to learn on that trip, total philanthropic spend to food and climate in Brazil is $10 million a year. It is so tiny. That is
okay. Yeah, I was like, I hope my face isn't making too much of a face, but I'm like, that doesn't.
That's not an impressive number.
No. Okay, good. I'm glad we're on the same page.
Yeah. We need to grow that number significantly, and we can, but it takes coordination. It takes learning from the Brazilian philanthropies like Arapiu, Clua, Ix, Porticus. There's a group there. They've largely been working together as a small sort of internal to Brazil group. And what we've grown over the last year and a half is the trust necessary to bring in some international funders. And I'm really excited to say that Raft now, one, put forward a sort of blueprint of best bets, no regret investment options in food and climate. They put that forward at something called Funders Table, which is basically a space to bring in climate funders who may or may not be food funders. That was rolled out in Q4 of last year. And now, based on the really exciting experience I just described that just happened, focused on Kenya and Tanzania with private and public and philanthropic investors working across the table with farmers and government on this Kenya subnational strategic investment framework, there's an intention to do the very same thing in Brazil. So I hope what we will see in the next, honestly, year to 2 years is a significant increase in Brazilian, like philanthropic funding flows to food and climate. And I would love to see at least a 2x within 2 years. And I think we could do much more as a group.
I love that. And that's music to my ears as, a strategist sort of working across those different capital stacks, and a relief too, because I mean, as you said too, and my face unfortunately doesn't lie, 10 million is underwhelming, completely underwhelming. And so much opportunity for, as you were saying, both like the trust building and the value of place-based philanthropy, including the funders, not just the focus on grantees in a specific area, but also the, having more of that skin in the game in terms of, philanthropic dollars. You mentioned climate philanthropy, and maybe I'll ask a few more questions. I'm realizing we are already almost at time, which is sort of crazy. Climate philanthropy has become my near borderline obsession in my work in food systems. And maybe you've experienced this too, where the food and philanthropy, the food philanthropy, and the climate philanthropy world have historically been quite separate. When we have thought about food and ag, we're thinking about food security, and we're thinking about, the World Food Program, and we're thinking about Feeding America or Global Food Banking Network. We're thinking about farmers and agribusiness. And then climate philanthropy is, renewables, or environmental philanthropy being, biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Yet we're literally all talking about the same thing, and yet the circles are different. How has that evolved in your mind? Because what is getting me excited is climate philanthropists are coming in large and in charge. Like, they're really coming to the table. There is, and even in your thesis of work, food solutions as the climate solution. How are you inviting, educating, tussling with these climate philanthropists to bring them into this world? And how easy or hard of a, quote unquote, sell is it to help them understand that, hey, if you're really focused on climate and nature-based solutions, you got to be focusing on food?
It's such an insightful observation, Eva, and I couldn't agree more that these have been really separate pools of capital. And why is that? Like, we need to understand why is that separate? Yeah, and then we need to solve it. What's giving me much excitement, there's actually a number of foundations that have observed the same thing and are leaning in on this right now. There's actually a little group, High Tide Foundation, Robertson Foundation, Climate Works, Bezos Earth Fund, Gates Foundation, Porticus, and the list goes on. We're offering some support there too, to overcome what we think is one of the problems. So we think one of the problems is the food world is so complex, right? Especially once you go to the production side, but the consumption side is really, really complex too. We use really unappealing jargon. We can sound, the barrier to entry is quite high. And we have some dogma where, it's over here, it's organic or nothing. Over there, it's climate smart or nothing. Over there, it's agroecological. Over here, it's diets. Over there, we can't talk about healthy diets. Over there, we only talk about the measurement of healthy diet. It is a hard community to sense make. You have to have some patience to find your bearings, and maybe for some climate funders, that sense of urgency makes the notion of kind of slogging through the chaos a little unappealing. I also think because so much climate funding did begin on the energy side and the kind of renewable side, I always use this juxtaposition. All power and electricity comes from, I believe the number is 40,000 power stations in the world. Food comes from 600 million independent producers who exist within households that have 1.5 million human beings who live in a farming household. So if you think it's just about like organizing and creating clarity of how the system moves, we're talking about orders of magnitude more complexity just on who's growing the food, let alone who's processing, shipping, distributing seeds, inputs, and on it goes. So I think there is we've lost folks with the complexity. We've lost folks with the language, and we need to simplify. So this group of foundations that I just mentioned is trying to basically create a more welcoming mat at the door and trying to just create a simple narrative. When we talk about food, there's 5 buckets. We're talking about production, we're talking about nutrition and diets, and the list goes on. It's actually a pretty hard task, but the ambition, I think, is right. And we hope that we can use a tool that sort of maps investable opportunities to really clear kind of buckets of needed interventions, that we can test that out with groups coming into like the Climate Leaders Initiative and other portals where the food curious are coming in from climate worlds. Because the fact is, it's very compelling to tell a climate person, I get that you're more familiar and comfortable on that side of the fence, but you're never going to meet the Paris Declaration. It is unattainable if you don't touch food. You have to. We're a third of it. And we've been a rather ignored third. If we look at the NDC, it's less than 2% of climate funding goes to food. So it's completely out of whack. So these funding flows have to, radically increase if we're to solve the challenges that we're here to solve.
I'm so glad we have you on the case then for that, because it is so unbelievable, and of course, yes, you're part of this amazing, fabric of other players, but there is something about that signaling coming from you and from a Rockefeller. Just briefly on that front before I ask a closing question is, what, if anything, do you feel like you need as a leading philanthropic voice who does know that you're almost playing like, that conduit role, that translator for climate funders? What do you wish that they could understand telepathically, or, a tool, a resource, a magic wand of understanding, maybe even a piece of science that has, that hasn't been sort of proven yet, that would be an unlock where you're like, oh, then I don't have to be beating this drum in this way any longer because it's so intuitive to climate funders?
I mean, we've really doubled down as Rockefeller, as we do, on the science and research agenda underpinning the regenerative transition. What's known, what's unknown. And I think what's just so frustrating is that there's just these truisms out there that regenerative is cute, but it can't feed the world, that are just fundamentally not accurate. There's a lot of nuance, and it matters so much what you're trying to grow, who's growing it, and where you're growing. So unqualified statements are helpful to absolutely no one, but get on the ground, look at the soil data, talk to farmers that are doing this, learn about the profitability and the productivity potential of climate resilient agriculture before suggesting that we need to double down on business as usual, because I think this is an inevitable transition. Actually, I don't think it's going to stay fringe and sort of the minority paradigm. But I think we're going to get even closer to the edge in terms of how our ecosystems are struggling and how the ecosystem services are being so disrupted by the dominance of conventional fossil fuel dependent, chemically dependent agriculture. And I think there's a future where farmers not only can feed themselves, which should be such a necessity.
It should be an obvious.
It should be an obvious thing that
already.
Farmers can't. That farmers can feed themselves, but more see their children go to school and see their ability to have the house that they need for their families to grow while doing right by the planet and doing right by their communities. The science is there. We just need to continue funding it. We need to contextualize it. and we need to be brave. This is a time globally of disruption at a scale most of us have never witnessed before. And so the things we didn't think were possible are happening all around us, maybe some for the negative. Why not make this one happen for the positive?
I love that. And we all need that right now too. And sort of leads me to my final question for you as well, in terms of what's next for, this initiative. We're sort of end of Q1, heading into World Bank spring meetings, and then we've got Climate Week in September. I'm sure things in between, COP30 in November, Davos in January, and I'm sure again sort of infinite touch points that you're doing. What's the drumbeat look like for you in this work over the next 10 to 12 months?
Well, we're going to be having a number of convenings and sort of what we hope are critical inflection points to grow the constituency of funders and investors, farmers, governments, and crucial producer groups and consumer groups around this agenda over the year. We'll be hosting a signature convening on the margins of the UN Food System Summit in Addis. So if you're coming to Ethiopia, please let us know. It should be a really spectacular conversation with a lot of participation across constituencies. There is in Fortaleza, Brazil, ministers of education from across the world are coming together for a summit on school meals. We'll be bringing some really exciting news forward then at that time. And then we're planning for both UNGA, but also for COP30 in Brazil to be really powerful moments where we bring forward new research, sort of making the case of why this regenerative school meals opportunity is the proof point the world needs, that we can not only enable this regenerative transition, but do so in a way that supports our most crucial consumers. And so I really hope if anybody's interested in that particular piece of the puzzle, you'll reach out to us, you'll join us, you'll share what you're learning, and we can only do this together.
I love that. Thank you. And that is the sort of glimmer of optimism I certainly need right now, and probably others in this work. So I'm just so grateful for your time, Sara. Thank you so much for being part of this great conversation, and has been really enlightening to sort of learn even more about the interworkings of Rockefeller. I also want to thank our listeners for joining me for everything but the Carbon Sink on the Spoon Network. I hope this discussion and all the ones that you hear on the show inspire you to think differently about the role we all play in transforming our food system. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. Share it with others who also care about building a sustainable food future. So see you next time, and thank you.
Thanks. Bye.